Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say a massive thank you to Atheism UK and the Origins podcast for putting this event together, and particularly to John for inviting me to speak today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but it's nice to know that events like this are happening here in Britain to encourage, inspire, and unite us all so that we have spaces, however intimate, such as this one, where we can openly interact with like minded individuals. It's a privilege for me to be part of such an esteemed panel here today. So, on behalf of all ex Muslims of Britain, thank you, John, for giving us a platform. As I mentioned, the importance of events and spaces like this, it is slightly disheartening and disappointing that whenever the subject of Islam is involved, naturally the atmosphere seems to suddenly heighten. The fact that Salman Rushdie was stabbed multiple times 2 years ago on the back of a fatwa from over 30 years ago is testament to that. The fact that even in a city like London, we wonder if people who can enter are vetted or not when we host events like this. And in a city like London, this is testament to why silence is not an option. It's testament to why what we say is so important and is the need of the hour. Basically, the fact that in one of the oldest and most cosmopolitan cities like London, we are subject to, especially ex Muslims or blasphemers or apostates, or anybody who speaks out against the ideology of Islam, is subject to the same fears as we would be in 7th century Arabia or modern day Iran or even Pakistan. This is testament to the nature of Islam and its very real and explicit call to violence for dissenters and people who openly dare to question the morals and the barbarity enshrined within its ideology. The recent growing trend of Islamist propagandists flooding and descending on the streets of London in their thousands, MPs being intimidated and threatened, head teachers being answerable in court to allegations of Islamophobia and discrimination, a teacher from Batley Grammar School having to go into hiding for merely doing his job for fear of his life. These are the very real threats that we are dealing with at the moment in the UK and that we face from Islam's adherent followers while sitting here in 2024 in the heart of the democratic West. And that is precisely why silence again is not an option. Freedom of conscience is a fundamental human right, yet in 12 countries, leaving Islam is punishable by death. Now that I've laid bare the threat of Islam somewhat, let me tell you a little bit about how I got there. So, I was born in the UK and then I lived here till I was 9 and moved to the Middle East for most of my adolescent years. Having come back to the UK for university, and I studied actually a module of Islamic law, I was very much a believing Muslim. And obviously, there were elements of the religion that I thought were a bit strange, and there was that level of cognitive dissonance. But in my heart of hearts, I genuinely believed in God and Allah, and whatever I guess the majority of claims Islam makes for itself. Um, so after university, having gone straight back to the United Arab Emirates, where my family was staying at the time, I, a couple of years later, ended up getting married. And that marriage fell apart very quickly. There were levels of abuse that were at play, and I was turning into like a shadow of my former self. So I could see myself kind of just, going down this rabbit hole, not understanding what was happening to me. Before the abuse got physical, I had made a plan to kind of get out of there, at least in my mind. So, as I was trying to kind of put that plan in order, and my father got to the country and he realized kind of what I was going through, and he kind of just said, "Let's get you out of there straight away." So, thankfully, I was able to kind of get out and secure myself and kind of move back in with my parents and start a new job. But that's when real Islam hit me, because for the first time I realized I was living in a city where all that glitters is not gold. You're in the United Arab Emirates, and it might seem all, work hard, play hard, lots of expats. It's one of the, it's sold as one of the best lifestyles you can go and have, especially coming from Europe or rainy Europe, or what have you. But you have to remember, or I was forced to remember, that Sharia is at play there. So when obviously my ex-husband did not want me to get a divorce and did not want us to separate, and realized that, I had managed to get out of there and build a new life, he instructed a lawyer who essentially put an ancient Sharia law on me, which is called Da'a Zawjiyya in Arabic, which pertains to the disobedience of the wife. And essentially, I got a call from the UAE police saying that I had to forcibly return to my husband's house, otherwise, they could arrest me. And once I was back in that house, I am not to leave the house without his permission. And obviously, at the time, I thought this was crazy. And I was on my way to work and I ran back to my parents. And even they, coming from, again, more of a British background, thought this is crazy. How can anybody do this? And I thought the same thing, but I said, well, over here they can. And that was like a very, very insanely dark chapter of my life, trying to kind of deal with this Dubai police and this kind of inherently misogynistic and heavily religious system where disobedience can mean anything from you kind of answering back to not wanting to live with a husband or outright wanting a divorce on the basis of, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, things like that. So even then, it was such a close call, because the way that they wear you down as a woman in that country just trying to fight for your rights, and it all stems from the fact that in Islam, only a husband has the unilateral right to divorce. And this all goes back to the Quran itself, but obviously at the time I didn't know any of this. So I just thought these were men kind of abusing the power and the system. But when things got really, really intense and I was being stalked and followed and harassed and the police weren't doing anything, they kept asking for my passport, because once they have your passport, they can kind of, lock you in to that country. And I'd lived there long enough to know that this is essentially you handing over control to them if you go ahead and do that. So that's kind of like your last bastion of freedom, if you will, or security, to be able to leave there if they don't put a travel ban on you. And essentially, that's what they were going to do. They were going to charge me with a whole host of allegations under Sharia to give me quite a maximum penalty, and obviously make sure that these charges stick. So to have me travel banned from the country would allow them to do that. Thankfully, at the very last minute, just when I was about to hand my passport over and I couldn't deal with it anymore, I called the emergency number for British expatriates in Dubai, and this angel of a man answered, and I just quickly gave him a 30-second rundown of my story, and what they were supposedly about to charge me with, and the fact that they were asking for my passport. And this man essentially said, I can't give you legal advice, but do you still have your passport in your hand? And I obviously answered in the affirmative. And he said, right, just get out of there. Get on a plane and come home to where these things don't exist. They don't matter. These ludicrous charges can't be leveled against you. And yeah, I literally just shut the phone and headed straight to the airport and landed back in London via Baku. And my life was never the same again. Um, so having said that, coming back to London pretty much heavily traumatized and, confused about what had gone down and what had happened and what this means for my religion and my relationship with the Middle East and all of these things. After things had settled down, I obviously, having grown up, I'd never had access to a free internet. Even in the UAE and before that in Saudi Arabia, it's very controlled what you can see and read and access, unless you use VPN, but you don't do that until you're older anyway, because you don't really have your own laptops and things like that. And they keep scaring you that if you get charged for any other crime and you also use VPN, then it's going to double the charges. So they really dissuade you from kind of doing independent research. And obviously, it's kind of a police state in terms of what you can say and can't say. So London felt free, where I could actually just search the web. And after pondering on like what I had gone through and what happened to me, I realized I need to defend my religion in the United Kingdom. When I tell people my experience, people here might say, "Oh, well, that's exactly what happens, and that's what happens in Sharia countries." But I was adamant that that's not what my God would ever allow for, or let alone proclaim and ordain and, set in stone in the Quran. But then, lo and behold, I was like, I'm going to read it myself. I'm going to read, because I knew that Sharia is derived from the Quran. And for the first time, I read it with an open mind and an adult mind. And like I said, I'd studied Islamic law at university and I had a law and economics degree. So I tried to look at it with more of a scrutinizing mind. And as soon as I went to the Quran and I went to the verse for women, 434 especially, but that whole chapter is called Women. Um, it was abysmal. And I thought, oh my goodness, if I was those men, I could definitely extract the Azawjiyah from this. In fact, it's very open ended. You could do a lot with this. So legally, there is a lot of potential scope for that to be misused in that way or used effectively in that way, because that's what they were going for. Um, so again, I couldn't believe it, and I wanted to defend it and still stay religious, obviously, and I wanted to hold on to my belief. So I thought maybe this is God's really open-ended way of saying it, but Muhammad in his lifetime came and he would have, set the record straight. So then I looked into Muhammad's life, and as a Sunni, I looked into the Hadith, and it just went more and more downhill. I was absolutely horrified by the things I had seen. And so, yeah, it opened a whole nother can of worms. And for the first time in my life, I started Googling, is Islam the truth? Um, and I wouldn't even take anybody's word for it unless they were a native Arabic speaker. So I followed a lot of those kind of channels and started watching videos, consuming content, and I came across the Four Horsemen as well. And I started listening to a lot of Hitchens, and I realized every criticism for Christianity can be applied just as well, if not harder, on Islam because of the claims that Islam makes for itself. And inevitably, my faith came crumbling down. And not just that, but I felt like I could not keep quiet about the horrors that I've read and seen and witnessed and that are being perpetrated around the world because of this religion. And that's kind of why I am here and how I've got to where I am now and what I kind of strive to do in my spare time. Um, but essentially, what my takeaway in terms of a woman and what happened to me was that I realized in Islam, at best, you are property. Always the property of a male, whether it be your father, your brother, your uncle, your grandfather, your husband, or even your son. Um, I realize, and I will keep saying this, that Islam is fundamentally not pro women. It is nowhere near the most feminist religion. It's not even pro humanity. If anything, it's anti women, anti life, anti humanity. It keeps you caught up in rituals, often in a foreign language for most Muslims, and like most religion, it preys on fear and guilt and the ever present carrot and stick. In Islam, words from Allah are meant to be timeless. These verses and these passages that we read are divine words that Muslims claim we are supposed to derive our morality from. So, in essence, the Quran was something that I was supposed to derive my morality from, and essentially that's where Sharia comes from. And it just doesn't even hold up against the Human Rights Charter, to be honest. But apparently, the wisdom of comparing women to domestic animals, or telling Muslims to push Christians and Jews to the narrowest part of the street, or granting permission to own and trade sex slaves, we wouldn't know right from wrong. We need to acknowledge the plight of women and the ills committed in the name of Islam within Muslim majority countries, but also within Muslim communities here within the UK. For example, the grooming gang scandal, dishonor killings, and upholding family reputation, these are all inextricably linked with the inherent flaws and regressive ideals found within Islam. As is the gender apartheid and denial of education for women and girls taking place in Afghanistan, girls on the verge of completing their high school diploma or women on the verge of completing their PhDs suddenly have had their whole future snatched out of their hands. As is the strength of Iranian women who are rising up against the theocratic regime as we speak. The buck cannot stop at culture or identity politics anymore. We have to look past that to things that make us uncomfortable. It's so easy to blame everything on culture, but culture evolves over time. Religion and religious dogma doesn't. It does not allow for backtracking or bending itself to protect human values. This is exactly why we must call it out for what it is and put the spotlight back on Islam and its very tenets. This is why we must take the focus back off the 5 pillars of Islam and focus on the 5 pillars of enlightenment. We should push to educate our girls and boys from the very beginning, not in memorizing Arabic words from an ancient book, but in things like the scientific method, freedom of expression, freedom of inquiry, and freedom from religion and dogma. If you're given access to an education, which is the fundamental right of every human being, and taught to be equal from a young age, as well as taught to think critically, then those girls, for example, the ones in Afghanistan, will not silently accept their position or being likened to donkeys or chattels as per Mohammedan Islam. It is these very girls that will give rise to a whole new generation of empowered women, free from the shackles of being labeled as inferior and deficient in intelligence. This is and can only be good for humanity as a whole. And this is precisely why silence is not an option. As a beacon of democracy and free speech, we must protect our shared British values at all costs. Thank you for listening to me. I hope I've contributed to this discussion and moved it along in however small of a way. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening with the wonderful speakers ahead. Their voices are the kind that I aspire rise like a phoenix from the ashes of the Muslim world. Thank you, everyone.